Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Pilot Lawyer Podcast. Thank you for your attention while this important legal information is reviewed. What you hear should not replace consultation with an attorney and should not be considered advice for your situation. On behalf of the Pilot Lawyer and your entire crew, it's our pleasure to have you aboard.
Welcome, aviators, to the Pilot Lawyer Podcast with us, the Ison Brothers at the Ison Law Firm. We're here to help pilots and those who want to become pilots navigate the FAA medical certification process. And of course, as we say around the office, if you don't laugh, you cry. And for the next 30 minutes, we hope to bring you the lighter side of what can otherwise be a frustrating process. So whether you're laughing at us or with us, join us, Ison Brothers, as we discuss the fascinating world of FAA medical certification.
See how much better it goes when you read from the little scrap of paper?
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about my weekend. May I?
I don't know. May you?
We watched the Kentucky Derby, and I went and got some balloons. I got balloons that were in the shape of horses and also red and green. The balloons were red, and the strings were green, as though to look like a rose because it's a race for the roses. Also bought some roses because they were right there. I thought, oh, this would be nice. And as I was waiting for the balloons to be blown up, and it was a bit conspicuous because they were blowing up large horses and they were tying them to my shopping cart. Some lady in her, what appeared to be about a 30-year-old, I gathered it to be a son. They looked as though their socioeconomic status was low, right? I mean, that's a nice way of saying they seemed a little rough around the edges. And as they walked past my cart, me buying the horse and rose balloons and the actual roses, the mother said to the son, "You don't need balloons to watch, do you?" like as though I was some sort of sissy for having balloons to watch the Kentucky Derby. And then at that point, I regretted even having the balloons. And there's no way to disconnect the balloons from my cart because I had them blow them up special.
That's insane.
So,
How does she know it's for the Derby? Could have been for your kid's birthday party.
Yeah, maybe.
They're into racehorses.
It was the day of the Kentucky Derby.
People weren't born on that day.
How about that horse losing journalism?
Yeah.
It's just a crazy thing.
Journalism, the one you bet on?
I didn't bet on anything.
I done told you not to bet on that horse.
It was a nose away.
Yeah, I told you that horse, it was all a big journalism conspiracy.
It's on its way.
They just wanted to get their name out there.
Fake news.
Well,
it's on its way to the glue factory now. Speaking of glue, we're here today to talk about selecting a HIMS psychiatrist. A HIMS psychiatrist. Is it psychiatrist or psychiatrist? I'll hear the psychiatrists call it psychiatry, right? Psychiatry.
That was psychiatric.
Psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist.
All right. So why would you need a HIMS psychiatrist? I'll open the floor for discussion.
Probably a history of SSRI use.
That seems reasonable. Although there's an argument to say that the SSRI protocol doesn't require a HIMS psychiatrist, but would be satisfied with a board-certified psychiatrist. So in theory, if your treating psychiatrist is a board-certified psychiatrist, then you wouldn't need the HIMS psychiatric evaluation. You would only need the HIMS neuropsych evaluation, which is a watered-down battery of the full HIMS neuropsych evaluation. So yes and no. But sometimes, most of the time, we'll add a HIMS psych eval on top of the SSRI protocol. Christopher, you got one? What else would you need a HIMS psychiatrist?
Substance abuse, dependence.
Good one.
Use disorder.
Good one. You got one. Substance use concerns.
I gave you 3.
Now, recently, we've noticed that the FAA would like also for the HIMS psychiatrist. Not only beyond being HIMS trained for the substance use cases, they're also going to want some type of board certification in addiction medicine. So they're not going to be satisfied with just a HIMS psychiatric evaluation in some cases. They're going to want this extra layer of addiction board certification.
Seems like a very small pool of people that you could choose from.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now, there's also some cases where they're going to want evaluation for maybe you're not taking an SSRI, but you've had a history of some type of mental health diagnosis, depression, anxiety, adjustment disorder, bipolar, and you're trying to either discredit the diagnosis or you're trying to establish that without medication, the history is remote enough and not significant enough to where it won't be recurring in nature to where it could be aeromedically significant down the road. So the question then becomes, well, I know I'm either going to need a HIMS psychiatrist or the FAA has asked for a HIMS psychiatric evaluation. What do I do next? Now, what I find frustrating, and I don't know the rationale for this, maybe we can ascertain what that would be.
Flush that out.
But they publish a list of HIMS neuropsychologists and psychologists. All right. There's a list of these individuals. But if they don't publish a list of HIMS psychiatrists.
Weird.
Why is that, Christopher?
It's because they want to have control over the process. It's all about control, power and control. Who's got the most power? Who has the most control? How can they control your life? How can they have power over you?
So, is control tantamount to power?
Secondary to money.
Where did tantamount come from? Where'd that word come from? Look it up. So
I don't know why they don't have a list. It's stupid that they don't have a list. You would think, hey, put a list out there. Tell me to go see a HIMS psychiatrist. You go to the list, you pick the person you want to go to, and then off you go. Otherwise, it seems like, oh, well, I went to the person they told me to see, and they didn't have a good report, and so the FAA is this big, conspiracy against me and blah, blah, blah.
Well, sometimes what they'll do in the letter, they'll say, contact your local HIMS AME or contact a HIMS AME to find out where there's a HIMS psychiatrist close to you. Or sometimes in the letter, they'll say, we can recommend these people close to you. Now, how do you feel about going based off? So we've identified that, one, we know why we need a psychiatric evaluation. Then we know that there's not going to be a list to choose from. So how do I go about picking an individual to do this evaluation? How do I go based off of where they're located once I'm able to find one? Do I find where they're located? Do I go off of how expensive they are? Do I go off of how long they're going to take to generate their report? Do I go based off of their website and what it looks like? Do I go based off of how ugly they look? What is it that what's my rationale for number one? What's my number one, would you say, sort of filter when I'm looking for a HIMS psychiatrist? And it's not as though I would posit that it's not like you're going to get a wildly different opinion. It's not like you can't go and buy a good evaluation. So that's not what we're suggesting if you're listening in, FAA. We're not saying you can go and buy a good evaluation and so on. But there is an element here where I think you have to look for individuals who have an understanding of FAA expectations and what their expectations are as far as the process is concerned with gathering and reviewing records, submitting reports, and so on and so forth. So they have to have a good understanding of FAA protocol from a procedural perspective, as well as what the FAA is expecting from a substantive perspective. Do they have an understanding of the CFRs from an appropriate standpoint, especially if it's a substance use evaluation and the distinction between substance abuse and substance dependence under the regulations versus the sort of the real world criteria under the DSM-5. And so if you produce an evaluation where the psychiatrist is just speaking to your clinical status or impressions, the FAA is not going to give that much credence whatsoever. Whereas if the psychiatrist is speaking to the expectations under the regulations, that's what the FAA is going to be looking for. So now, whereas you can get individuals that are HIMS trained, they've gone to the weekend class or whatnot, do they really have the understanding that the FAA is looking for? I think is an important thing to consider. But beyond that, I think we also have to look at, well, what do they offer from a clinical perspective, in so much as are they going to be sort of reasonable in their understanding of your history and their application of the clinical picture to the regulatory scheme, right? In other words, are they going to automatically just say, hey, I don't want to feel comfortable about this just because I am ultra conservative from a risk to aviation safety perspective? Or can they say, well, hey, really, I see these type of clinical things all the time. You're not at risk for recurrence of symptoms from a depression standpoint per se. And here's why I don't think you are at risk for recurrence of symptoms. And I think I can make this apply to the regulations for the FAA to consider, and so on and so forth. So you have to kind of look for somebody who is, going to be able to be reasonable in that perspective. So I think in that capacity, how can you really judge that? I think the idea is that you're going to have at least some type of initial consultation or have some understanding that the psychiatrist has a good rapport with pilots and the FAA before jumping into an evaluation. So have some type of understanding of this person's style rather than just saying, hey, here's somebody 2 miles down the road. I just call a schedule an appointment and that be that. So that's an important filter, I think. But my point here is that proximity to where you live, I would say is not super important.
You need to be willing to travel for it.
Yeah, I'd say be willing to travel because someone's local to you, if there is someone local to you, that's another problem. Some of these people are far and few between. I don't think will always be a good thing to consider. Now, have you got any filler, Christopher? Anything you can fill here, Alex?
I think you're definitely hitting the nail on the head as far as their relationship with the FAA. But, I mean, you're going into this with this person as well. You got to be able to work with them as well. I mean,
how are you going to know who to go to if you can't find them in a list? I mean, if you call up your HIMS AME and say, hey, I need to see a HIMS psychiatrist. Oh, go see this guy. I mean, it's not like you have a lot of options at your fingertips. How are you going to figure out where other HIMS psychiatrists practice? Now,
I don't know. You tell me.
I will say this. I think there's somebody out there on the internet that's put together a list of HIMS psychiatrists.
There is some fake list that's not FAA published.
Yeah, it's not from the FAA. So you might be able to find a list of HIMS psychiatrists out there floating around on the internet to the extent it's valid, to the extent it's updated.
Has your FAA medical certificate been denied? Are you concerned you may not be able to get a medical certificate from the FAA? Are you at risk for FAA action for failing to report your medical history appropriately? Call the pilot lawyer at 1-855-FAA-1215 to discuss your options for getting the FAA to issue your medical certificate and get you flying. We are happy to evaluate your case and discuss with you a plan for presenting your case to the AME or the FAA. Aviation law is all we do, nothing else.
All right, so if you're able to find a list, now there are people that may be able to offer, recommendations, right? Maybe it's us. Maybe there's some other third party that, and I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes third parties have relationships with psychiatrists to the extent that they know what their process is like. They know that the FAA accepts evaluations from them, that they have good credentials, and I think in many cases that is something that can be offered by somebody that's able to help you, through the process.
Us,
sure.
No, why beat around the bush?
Yeah. So can I see the psychiatrist in person or can it be virtual? What do you think on that? Go ahead, Christopher. Why don't you just focus on the job here for just a second while we try to wrap this up.
It's going to have to be in person unless there's some limited exception allowed for and approved by the FAA for it to be virtual. But they recently came out with guidance saying we're done with all this virtual psychiatric evaluation mumbo jumbo. That was kind of a byproduct of the whole COVID era. They allowed people to go from having in-person evaluations to virtual. And so for the longest time, people just kind of kept going with the virtual. And they didn't have any guidance out. And they didn't really say, no, we're not going to accept this anymore. Although there were rumblings. Every so often you get this random one where a person would have a virtual evaluation and then they wouldn't accept it. And in the applicant notes, they say, it needs to be an in-person evaluation. But they would really need no reason as to why it needed to be in person, especially since no guidance had been out. But I don't know, month and a half, 2 months ago, they came out with guidance saying about the time Trump said everybody needs to return to work. And I think this is kind of why it's now no longer a virtual thing. They now require all HIMS psychiatric evaluations to be in person.
So needs to be in person. Now, there are some follow-ups that can be done virtually, as I understand, but it's fairly far and few between. But I think some of the changes we've seen lately is that, one, these initial evaluations need to be done in person, no exceptions. Two, there are going to be times where the FAA is looking for someone who is board certified in addiction psychiatry. And then other times we've seen cases where they want the psychiatrist to be board certified in forensic psychiatry as well, or one or the other. So it's really going to depend on what your circumstances are. Like if you have some type of alcohol or drug related concern that you're trying to discredit, if you will, more likely than not, they're going to ask for that addiction certification, maybe even the forensics certification. We've seen cases where there's been questions like personality disorder, bipolar disorder, where the FAA has asked for that board certification in forensic psychiatry. But that brings us up to today's cockpit conundrum. Are you interested in hearing about it, or just want me to rattle it off and you guys just
go for
continue?
it?
I'll figure it out.
Whatever you're doing there. First Officer Rebecca has always been calm under pressure, respected by her peers, and known for her precise flying. Lately, though, the captain she flies with regularly has noticed subtle changes. Rebecca's humor is gone. She's unusually quiet on layovers. Twice, she missed mandatory crew briefings, claiming she, quote, just forgot. In the flight deck, she's slower to respond and double checks her instruments repeatedly, even when there's no indication of error, or as they like to say in the South, error. When asked if she's okay, Rebecca simply says she's tired and going through stuff at home. The captain feels uneasy. There's no violation of FAA regs, no obvious impairment, but the gut instinct is strong. Something's off. Here's the conundrum. What should the captain do? Is this a reportable mental health concern? Does raising the issue risk Rebecca's career unjustly? Or is it riskier to stay silent and hope it resolves? So, what tools and protections exist for pilots facing mental health challenges? This is something that could be...
He should go get a DSM-5 diagnosis with a major depressive disorder, recurrent, and then hotline complainer.
That won't screw it up for her. What if he went to medical school, got a degree in medicine?
Some people are just petty enough, though, to do that.
Went through all residency and everything else. Become a psychiatrist. Practiced for 5 years. Then diagnosed her, unbeknownst to her.
Are we going to give the answer now, or are we going to do it later? We might as well do it now.
You pretty much have a thing to say. Well, we'll go ahead and we can discuss it.
Seems to me that if you did a hotline complaint, even though it would be anonymous, there's probably some
Well, what are you going to say?
some detail there. Oh, well, I'm flying with this person and they really seem out of it and they don't. I mean,
She's going to.
I think it would be, there's probably going to be enough to tie it back to him. Then I
Maybe
think,
that's not a problem.
well, I think that could be from a defamatory standpoint. If there hasn't been any kind of regulatory breaches, she hasn't caused any kind of violations or anything because of her change in demeanor, and he's over here spouting off saying, oh, well, this person just doesn't seem up to par like they used to be, but nothing's really wrong. But
And I've got a friend that's a psychiatrist, and she,
yeah, I think
she's already gone to the maybe the FAA already knows about her problem.
I guess the concern there would be, well, if you start saying stuff that could be defamatory, that might expose that person to liability. So maybe you want to double check yourself before you go out there and even lodge a hotline complaint on the off chance that it is tied back to you. I would just say that
Perhaps.
first and foremost.
Perhaps. Now, maybe you've got some employment-related obligation that we don't handle. So don't come at me with some, my company's obligated me to.
Every company is going to have probably some different standards. It's going to be based on the state in which the company is, incorporated or set up business as based on employee-employer contracts. I don't know. So that's a whole separate issue.
Some union.
Yeah.
Contract.
So from an FAA standpoint,
really, that's all we're looking at. Well, I guess the question here is that what obligation does the one pilot, the captain, have to report Rebecca or to take some action from an FAA perspective? And I don't know of a regulation that would necessarily obligate, just because he doesn't like how her personality has changed, does that obligate him to do something different? Now, if she were acting unsafe, that's one thing. I think at that point he's got to be.
I suppose to the extent he's the captain and he has probably a final decision on the aircraft and what goes on in the aircraft. And the buck stops with him in that moment as they're operating the aircraft. Perhaps it would be.
What does that mean?
I don't know.
Stops with him. Look it up, Alex.
I think it might be prudent for him to say something. If he feels so strongly about it that something in his gut's telling him that something's off, perhaps he should inquire with her and make sure that she's safe to fly.
So you're saying he pull her aside? There can be witnesses, and say, hey, I've noticed you're a bit off lately.
Hey, Sarah Jean, how you doing?
Yeah.
Is everything okay? You doing?
Yeah.
What's going? There was something going on at home.
Yeah.
Right. Are you going to be able to focus? I've noticed that you've been a little distracted. You're doing fine.
Where are the drugs? Yeah.
I think that's about the best you're going to be able to do in that situation. And then depending upon what comes of it, if you feel that, she's not up to snuff, then I guess you'd have to maybe call your employer and say, hey, listen, again, I guess it stems from what are your obligations and duties as a captain, which is something we really have no knowledge of.
Well, you could say, I recommend, if depending on what comes to the conversation, I recommend you check in with your AME about how you've been, I've noticed these changes. You should talk to your AME about making sure you're safe to fly, or something along those lines, or maybe you should go see your doctor, just to make sure you're okay. Something along those lines. Now, a lot of people don't want to do that, and that's probably Rebecca's problem. She's probably suffering from a major mental health problem, and she's afraid to expose that for fear she'll lose her job. And I think that is a concern. That might be why maybe having a HIMS psychiatric evaluation, proactively to ascertain whether or not there is some sort of concern and to develop a plan to treat your symptoms or your history appropriately from an FAA perspective might be a prudent thing to do. But there are things that could be done to help the person through the process such that they don't need to lose their career and their jobs. And I think probably approaching your treatment plan up front from an FAA perspective would be prudent. Now, where'd that come from, Alex? The buck stops with him. Did you look
it's
it
a
up?
Harry S. Truman thing. That was his his saying that, everything stops with him and like he's responsible for it all. The buck stops there.
What's the buck, though?
It's a fugazi. It's a fugazi.
All right. Well, so if you're looking for a HIMS psychiatrist, there are things to consider. Again, what are the certifications of the psychiatrist? What's their history with the FAA? Or maybe you have an initial consult call just to see, well, do I even have a good rapport with this individual? I think how long is it going to take for you to generate a report? How much is this going to cost? I think is a reasonable question. I think what we'll see is anywhere from $2,000 to maybe $3,500 is about the ballpark for such an evaluation. Of course, depends on the amount of work and records that will have to be reviewed that could increase that cost. Anything you would recommend from a record standpoint before you see the psychiatrist?
Just to be sure that you have everything relative to your history of the condition that you're being evaluated for, and maybe even a detailed clinical progress note within the past 90 days from your treating physician, and gathering up all your pharmacy records if you're on medication.
Yeah, the psychiatrist is going to want to see all your records, like you said, so all treatment records, pharmacy records in some cases. They're going to want your FAA file directly from the FAA. And lots of times the psychiatrist won't even schedule an appointment until they get the FAA file. The FAA likes to know that the psychiatrist is reviewing the same records that they are, that they're on the same page. So I think we've flogged another one here, and I think that wraps things up. I think we gave a cogent answer to the cockpit conundrum, and gave you some filters to consider when looking or selecting a HIMS psychiatrist. And I think that wraps it up. You've wasted another 26 precious minutes listening to the random musings of the Ison Law Firm. If you have any problems selecting a HIMS psychiatrist, you can give us a call.
More than happy to walk you through the process.
We'll walk you.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.